Inferno is the Italian for hell, an imaginary creation by the 14th century poet Dante. The Inferno is the first part of Divine Comedy, followed by Purgatorial and Paradiso. One of the most therapeutic books, accordingly, in the world. It is about a hero's journey through hell, guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. In this poem, hell is described as 9 concentric circles of torment located within the earth. It is, to quote the original, the realm of those who have rejected spiritual values by yielding to bestial appetites or violence, or by perverting their human intellect to fraud or malice against their fellow men. Since its publication, over 129 translators have shared their creative attempts in translating this work. And more frequently, among these translations are English. So with us today is Professor Marco Sanzini from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, who will talk about how different versions of translation highlight the thematic tension of Inferno. Hey, Marco, so excited to have you join the show. Could you please first introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Marco, and I studied languages at university. I always loved languages. I did my undergraduate studies in Italy, and then I did my postgraduate studies in Ireland, where I was for 12 years. I also started my academic career there, and then life circumstances, a job came up in New Zealand, I applied, and I pretty much did what Dante does at the end of Inferno, a somersault, and I came out the other side and in the other hemisphere, and I've been here now 16 years. And recently somebody called me a literary trickster and a cultural activist. I like to think of those two terms as describing me accurately. I love my job. My passion is to share cultural patrimony that's been shared with me and to pass it on for future generations. So I think, and I do that with a slightly counter. I like to look at things from a different perspective. And coming to New Zealand, in a way, I know it may sound cheap, but coming on the other side of the planet, literally, as well as allegorically, did change my view of things. You ask questions in a different way. You look at them in a different way. The sky moves in a different way. You open the tap, the water circles in a different way. So that's very refreshing, and it's also very humbling. You stop your prejudices, you leave your baggage, and you look afresh. And I think that's exactly what Dante does when he lifts up his head out of hell. He looks up at the sky, he sees, oh, so this is different. And he sees the Southern Cross, which I see every day. So every day that I see the Southern Cross, I think of Dante. There you go.
That sounds great. So let's start with the context. Could you talk a bit about why Dante was exiled and how this painful experience and philosophical reflection on it shaped the narrative structure of the poem?
Yes, now, sometimes we think of the Middle Ages as, very distant from us. But I think one of the things that Dante, the reason why Dante, 700 years after his death, 701 year after his death, is still there, is he was a 360-degree human. He came into life at a time of turmoil. The Middle Ages, a lot of things were changing. Italy was a collection of states, of languages, of cultures, of currencies. And his family, I think when Dante is born into Florence in one of the rare occasions where the Ghibellini party is in power. And I think he is from a Guelph family, not too influential. So he is there, and he finds himself aware of, if you like, change about to happen, or change, when those moments where you're on the crisp of change. And I think it's an exciting moment. And I think as we're trying to come out of a pandemic, big crises are always a prelude for big changes. So that he is, and I think he's a principled man, is what I like to think of as a committed civilian. He cares about the city, he cares about the state, he cares about values. And he's an intellectual. He probably reads everything that he can set his hands on. He reads a lot in translation. Mostly, he couldn't speak Greek, so everything that he reads, he would have come to him through Latin translation. And then, he starts thinking, what makes us a society, what makes us a place, what makes us people. And language and literature for him are and politics are an important part of it. And his political views, I don't want to call it political views, because to this day, there are people that question, was he Guelph or was Ghibellino? There are people saying one side of the story, people saying one other side of the story. What I'd like to say is that he was 100% aligned with his values.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that created tensions. He probably got on the wrong side of the stick with many people, and he had to leave. And I think the exilic experience, and we made, I might fast track a bit, and I'm thinking of a similar experience, for example, that the poet Shemusini did when he left Northern Ireland for the South. Was liberating. He started writing. He gave him a sense of the country, a sense of Italy, this constellation of languages and states. He also experienced patronage, so he experienced help, but he also experienced, how salty the bread that is cooked by others is, as he says, quanto sa di sale lo pane altrui, And it's, I think, through that kind of challenge, he fortified his own beliefs, but also his own literary mission, and he gifted us this wonderful poem. I think it's actually, it's actually the story of everybody's life. We go to hell. We have to go to hell. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Italian people and the Italian government chose the end of Inferno when we came out of lockdown. Inferno is a very advanced form of literary lockdown, if you allow me to use this, this expression.
So how is the poetic fashion of courtly love, and especially Dante's own courtly love with his childhood lover Beatrice, reflected in the poem? And how does the figure of Beatrice help the hero's journey in the poem?
It's a very, very, very good question. Now, among the many things that were changing at the time, there was this kind of new school of poetry. Yeah, I'm using this school of poetry, which was the Dolce Stil Novo, which wasn't just a school of poetry; it was a school of thinking, a school of life. And the origin of Italian poetry is in music, is in singing. Troubadours singing, and you need an inspiration. You're not necessarily singing for yourself. So the idea of some sort of enhancing and heightening form of inspiration, and the Dolce Stil Novo believed in courtly love. And in my years in Ireland, I realized that there are various forms around in world literature where courtly love, sort of platonic love that is not physical, is not sexual, but it is an instrument for elevation, for spiritual elevation. And so Dante in this is not alone. There are other poets that he learned from and writes in the same time, writes in the same fashion. And I think when he meets Beatrice, like when Petrarca meets Laura, whether fictional or allegorical, there is this sort of intervention of a muse that is codified as female and beautiful. And she could be real, she could be allegorical, but that's an opportunity to undertake a journey of elevation. And that's exactly what Dante does. I mean, she only comes in towards the end of the book, and he chooses he chooses a fellow poet to do the dirty work and be ready for when he's ready to meet her, then she becomes an instrument for further elevation. So, and that's not a bad way of figuring out a muse. Again, whether whether we want to believe in Beatrice and Laura as real people or imagine personified values, it never bothered me. But I like to think of Dante, and I'll tell you the story. I read a wonderful book about him. It's a fictional book by Giulio Leone, I think, and it's one of the finest books on fictionalized account of Dante's life that I've ever read. He's also he meets, if I remember correctly, an Arabic-looking Muslim woman in a tavern, and he's completely seduced by her. So this is the most anti-Dantean account of Dante that I've ever come across, but he makes him real. And that's what I love about the poet. This poet was, he was a man at a time engaged with the politics, paid a hard price. He was in battle. He saw what man is capable of, for better and for worse. And then went off and wrote 100 cantos of a poem that is edifying, is universal, is eternal in the way that it charts every human's opportunity to grow intellectually and spiritually if we want to. I mean, people will say this is very Christian and is very hellish and is very, dark ages. We don't write in isolation. Dante is a product of his own time and of his own readings and of his own ideas. But as I told you before we went on air, when people say that, my answer would be, where will you be in 700 years? Will anybody talk about you and me in 700 years? Probably not. So if 700 years on, we're still here talking about Dante, it means that he strokes some chords that are universal and that it touch, every human's life question very deeply.
That's right. That's right. What language is this Tuscan that Dante adopted to write the poem? And how different is it from Virgil's Latin, which was then considered a highly respected language of the elite society, right? And how the vernacularism of Tuscan describing a once obsolete worldview made the poem become what is now a celebrated iconoclast and linguistic invention?
That's a very good question. You could be talking about this for like a week.
Sure.
Now, if you're a writer, you're a writer, you start thinking, okay, what I want to do? How do I want to write? What language am I going to write? And then at some point you're going to ask the question, okay, if I want to get a job, what language am I going to use? And Latin was the language that every learned person at the time would write,
Right.
So, but then you start thinking, okay, I'm writing in this language. Will I be understood by how many? What are the options? I mean, that question, what we call in Italian, we call la questione della lingua, will continue to come right away to people think of Italy, maybe people associate Italy, as we've always been there. Well, the truth is we've been there as Italy only since 1861. Before then, we were a collection of states, each of which had its own language, its own dialect, its own currency, its own politics, its own way of doing things. So partly through exile, it's interesting because Dante writes this book called De Vulgari Eloquentia, which is a treaty on the purposes of having a sort of enhanced vernacular as a shared language. And he finishes in book, he wanted to write 4 books, and then he gets to chapter 14 in book 2 and he stops very abruptly. Scholars are trying to figure out what happened there. But I think it's a legitimate question. Now, I'm answering you also a little bit by detour. So Petrarca writes 365 sonnets for Laura, and he says, I'm very sorry, folks, this is not a serious piece of work because I'm using the vernacular. And then everybody remembers him for the vernacular, and nobody almost, unless you're a scholar of Petrarch's other writings, So sometimes things happen for a reason. You want to unify a group of people, a society. You want to find a way to be readable and accessible. As a writer myself, I want to be read by as many people as possible, and I have a choice. Am I going to write in a language that only a certain group will read? And then the other question will be, I think Dante had a pretty learned reader in mind when he wrote the Commedia, because all the allusions, all the quotations, all the references to the sources that are now made explicit in footnotes, they weren't exactly there at the time. So he sort of assumed that people would recognize them. I remember a scholar, we shall leave him nameless because he was one of my mentors and I loved him dearly. He said, the Divine Comedy is an appendix to the Aeneid. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there are a lot of similarities, and you can see that. But so the question is, you want to be learned, you want to be read, you want to be accessible, you want to make money, you want to become famous, you want the court to love you. These are all the questions. And I think at some point you go around, you find, and that's what Manzoni also did. Manzoni wrote I Promessi Sposi, which is another love story, if you like. And he wrote it in Milan. He is set in Milan. And then at some point he says, let me go to Florence, he says, to wash my clothes in the Arno, so to purify the language so that he loses dialectal and sort of foreign influences, and it becomes more accessible and readable by everybody. Now, that's what 1840, so that's 20 years before Italy has anything but a geographical unification. So Dante, in a way, sets in motion la questione della lingua. What is the language that we're going to write about? And just before him, I think a little bit before him, the poets were writing in various forms of Proto-Italian. And if you ask me, it is very different from Latin. It's certainly very different from Virgil's Latin, but language evolved like we do. Language age, every language ages through time.
That's
it
right.
gets in contact with other languages. It gets, I don't like to use the word corrupted. It gets contaminated, or it gets into contact with other linguistic possibilities. And who else but a writer can understand those points of contact better? And every serious writer will ask themselves the questions: which language am I going to write? Now, if we want to make make it an issue in a political issue, let's make it a political issue. At some point it becomes an issue of power balance. Indigenous people the Maori here in New Zealand, some of them write in Maori, and they have a very limited readership. Others, they do a counter-colonial, a post-colonial revenge. They take English and make English become their voice. So the question of which language I'm going to write in and why will always going to be there. And I think someone like you with a hyphenated identity, having, you know, English and Chinese, you'll be voicing different issues or different missions or visions about what you want to do and who you want to be through language. We are using this language with literary intentions. You're making a statement, and then people will say, all right, why? So and then from then on, Italian develops out of literary Tuscan. But if somebody else had said, and they could have said, I mean, you know where poetry is born? Poetry is born in the courtship of Frederick II in Sicily. The first sonneteers, Cielo d'Alcamo, all these people, they're there. If somebody there said, all right, this is the Italian literary language, from now on, we're using this one. But anyway, so that's a lot of story. I think that's why I love Italian so much, because there are multiple origins and languages in it that have made it what it is. And yes, we descend from Latin, but it's a long journey that is still continuing today. Yeah.
So in your opinion, why does Divine Comedy, and especially Inferno, attract Anglophone translators most?
It's a very good question. I mean, for starters, it's what I call, it's a three-dimensional book. You know, you like this idea of we all like a bit of crime and punishment stuff. You know, if you speak too much, you're going to be burning in hell and not being able to speak. You know, if you had too much sex, or if you were adulterous, then you're going to be chasing the person you want to be, and you never touch her. So this idea of, you know, sort of Manichaean, black and white, good or right and wrong, and we are all sort of feel very human. Every single possible aspect of humanity, from sex to food, politics, loyalty, disloyalty, they're all there. So they're very real stories. We can understand them. Now, with Purgatorio and Paradiso, it becomes, for many, very theological, very abstract. It's all about light and music and whispers, you know. So Inferno has this, and if you think about, you know, a lot of Dante's translators into English, they were Victorian, even Protestant ministers, people that said, oh, here we've got example. You know, if you don't behave, you don't leave, this is what happens to you. And fantastic. Rather than letting the Bible tell you that, why not use a work of literature to do that? I was astonished to see how many priests and pastors and ministers try to translate Divine Comedy. I remember this guy in Nottingham, he was Reverend Plumtree, who translates the first 5 cantos of Inferno, sends them on to Cardinal Newman, who sort of reads them and he says, oh yeah, thank you, yeah, they're not too bad, you know. And then he says, I was reading someone else's translation and it made me fall asleep. But it's clearly, as I say, everyone would recognize in Inferno, and maybe that's the purpose. Oh, I've done that. Oh yeah. Oh, I see what he talks about. And so they're very real stories, and stories that we can relate to. And also the idea of going through dark times, whether it's a forest or your room because you're depressed, or your office because you're being bullied, or the trenches of war in Ukraine, we are all going through some form of hell in one way or another. I cannot think of one person I know that hasn't been through hell and back once. So that is a very relatable story. Now, if you're telling people about the earthly paradise, loads of birds and lovely fruits and vegetables, and it's warm and you don't need any clothes, then I say, okay, I can go to Samoa, and that's exactly it. Earthly paradise exists. But as George Steiner said, early paradise must have been very boring. You know, you don't need language. You have direct communication with God. You're completely pure. Everything is perfect. It's a bit boring after a while. But Inferno, that you've got the juice, that you see the good and bad of humans, more bad than good. But there's always hope, and Dante gives you that. You know, it tells you in Canto 3, go through this door, there's no hope. But he is a firm believer in hope. You know, even Inferno ends with stars. You know, you've come up. We come up to see the stars again. Also, I often thought, I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I've spent a lot of time with Buddhist and Hinduist friends, and with Vaishnava, with spiritual, Vaishnava scholars and sages. And nirvana, you know, nirvana. I'm simplifying things, but nirvana, which is this place of realization, in Sanskrit, it means out of the forest. And you know, if you think of again, I'm bringing things a little bit, pushing the envelope a little bit here. If you think of people like Hare Krishna, for example, right? Now, the founder who came to America, he was a husband and he was a father. But what does he do? Because that's what his spiritual path is. He leaves the family, he leaves the wife being taken care by his children, and he goes to the forest. That's what a sage does. He goes to the forest. You enter the forest, you become enlightened, and you leave it. Now, what's the name that what's the Latin name for forest? The Latin people had this great idea to call things by their opposite. So they call war bellum. So the ugliest thing you can think of, they call it bellum, and they call the forest where things are dark, they call it lucus, which is where the word for light comes. So again, it's that experience that we can all relate to. We need to go through darkness to find the light. And Dante does that. I often think that some of his depiction of monsters, punishments, especially towards the end, when you get a Lucifer that has got 3 mouths, you know, chewing sinners at the same time. Now, when I was in Mayapur in India, and in a monastery, learning a bit of Sanskrit, I saw all this depiction of, you know, the god and goddesses there, Nrsimhadev, that it's eating Hiranyakashipu, and he's chewing it with all his mouths. So this multiple-headed, multiple-mouthed, you start thinking, where did Dante get this? It's not necessarily or entirely Christian. Then I started fantasizing. So maybe some books have come through the merchants to Florence, God only knows. But the story is very simple. We are human, we are fallible, we make mistakes, we go through hell, and if we're lucky, we come back from it.
That's right. In November 2007, the most popular clip on YouTube in Italy featured the actor Roberto Benigni reciting Canto 5 of the Inferno to a group of theater audience. This makes me wonder how difficult it is to translate a poem into English that is hard to echo the rhyme of the original. And what is Dante, even in translation, wholly without rhyme?
It's a wonderful question. Now, if you remember the cover of my book, I put a very grumpy face, a grumpy looking Dante for a reason.
That's right.
I think in Convivio, it says that when you translate, so when you separate meaning from the language that it was enveloped in, you break the legame mosaico. You break a bond, and that bond is lost. And every effort to rebuild it in another language is somewhat short. So yes, but you know, tough. We told him, you didn't want to be translated. Look at this book. Now we're giving you 200 translations. It's clearly a different experience. Now, Roberto Benigni being so popular, you often wonder, you know, if Benigni went on television and read Sudoku, he probably would have as wide an audience. So clearly there's a conversation there about popularizing an author like Dante that for a modern audience, it's difficult. I have no shame in saying that if I read Dante as an academic, I still have issues with the language. There are words, there are bits of it that I need to stop and get help or look at the notes or see what is this word. So I have no shame in saying that. And I would challenge every Dante scholar on the planet if they can tell me as native speakers, I understand every word of it. I don't believe it. Not because it's not possible, because that's also part of the beauty. So there's 2 different conversations. So the Benigni popularizing, bringing Dante on the scene, reading it out loud, it's absolutely fine. I mean, Benigni reading him is like an audiobook. You have this wonderful popular actor, very famous. And I think it's a nice way of bringing this author and this book that you study in school, you find difficult, you have the illusion that if you hear him, it's like when you read a book and when you listen to it on an audiobook. You read Ulysses on the page, it defeats you after 5 minutes. You may find the audiobook a different experience. So that's one story. When it comes to translation, I think that I disagree with Frost. You know, I don't think that poetry is what gets lost in translation. I actually think that poetry is what survives translation. Now, then we can discuss. There are good translators and translators that are successful and others that aren't successful. It's a different experience. And I'll finish the answer with one example. Clearly, Dante uses, you talked about rhyme. Dante uses the terza rima. Why does he use it? He uses the terza rima for two reasons. One, the terza rima is theological, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's Trinitarian, okay? But more importantly, I think, from a writerly point of view, it's a forward. It's like an engine that propels the narrative forward. It's very clever. It's like a chain. Now, why do I like Clive James's translation so much? Because he said, all right, I forfeit the terza rima, and then I can hear all the scholars of Dante saying, well, you're surrendering a big part, a very important theological component of Dante's language. Now, Clive James's ex-wife was one of the most influential and learned Dante scholars I've come across. So he's not doing that, easily. But what he does instead, he chooses the quatrain, which is has the same effect for English, has that propelling forward moment. Then we can discuss bits of Clive's translation that we like, others that we like more, others we like less. But I find in Clive James's that sort of very nice forward-moving narrative that makes the poem accessible. Now, if somebody wants to be a purist and say whatever they want to say, well, then there's only one solution. Study Italian, study medieval Italian, studies Dante, medieval Italian, read the original. And we're going to be here in 300 years discussing this again. I think it's our duty as humans is to share the gifts that we have in our own cultures and languages. And so I always favor translation. In fact, we have a lot to learn even from translations that are not successful. We learn more from translations that are not successful than from those who are.
We need that attitude in today's academia. About your 2017 book, To Hell and Back, an anthology of Dante's Inferno in English translation, a project you collaborated with your student, Timothy Smith. Could you talk about why this particular editorial choice by collecting different versions to form a whole and continuous narrative?
Yes. Now, I'm going to give Tim a bit of airtime. I just want to congratulate him. He got his PhD, DPhil, from Oxford last week in ancient history. So congratulations to Dr. Smith now.
Right.
Now, when Tim was a student, an undergraduate student, and then he did his thesis with me in literary translation, he titled it Dethroning Dante. And we often talked about that passage in Convivio where he does say you break the musée, that bond. And Tim has a wonderful disposition towards bibliography. So we started looking, at all these translations that were there. And I said to him one day, wouldn't it be nice to have to do an anthology? And Tim Parks, many years ago, reviewed some new translations, and the title of his new, I think it was for the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. The title was To Hell and Back is a phrase. So that's the To Hell and Back. Literally, we did that. We went to hell, so 1 to 33, and then we came back. In there, you compare, and we tried to match. It's subjective. We chose our pairings for a reason. Sometimes two ministers, two poets, two women, or a teacher and a student. That was the thinking. And we knew from day one that some old-fashioned, pedantic, boring, whatever in some whatever university would have come and say that doesn't work because you cannot read the Inferno backwards. Well, that isn't the point. But I even asked the publisher at some point, could we do it in a way that you can flip the book? That's the way we originally thought of it, so that there was no distinction of going to hell and coming back. It was just one continuous reading. But even as it is, and when I have in the electronic copy, you can click the chapters, you can move, you can say, okay, let me see what happened in this place at this time. Oh, let me see this academic, what job he did. Oh, let me see what Chemusini did with this. And it's a choice like any. I believe it's like when you translate, I always tell my students, I'm interested in the explanation. Right. If you tell me why you're doing what you're doing, then we may disagree. I may say, well, I disagree with the way you did it, but you need to legitimize it. And our mission was very simple, was to sort of document the variety of styles, prose, poetry, rhyming, no rhyming, terza rima, quatrain. And I was very, very happy to be able to do it while Clive James was still alive, because I have a lot of time. I have a lot of time for him. And yeah, he's much missed. And I think Yeah, when I was asked not long ago, which translation of Dante I would recommend students, I said, well, read Clive's. It's a wonderful reading. And then from then on, you can find out one that you prefer.
Can we look closely into one or two examples of these translated cantos, which you think are
Yes.
culturally significant and
Yeah.
linguistically daring? And
Yes.
in the process, could you please talk about what is the underlying logic of pairing and comparing two translators of the same cantos
Yes.
at a time?
Yeah. So let me just share the screen.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. And so here it is now. So if we go to Helen Beck, so I think there's a moment ago I saw the cover, and you may say, why do you want a cover? I want a cover because the cover has that grumpy face. So here we go. So let's start from the grumpy face. Okay. So that's our chronological range. So we go from quite a bit further back to, in fact, 2017. So so here's to him, very grumpy. So here's how the book looks like. So here on the left-hand side of the screen, of my screen, I have all the cantos, right? So for instance, let's start from canto 1. Nel mezzo, you have the most famous line, one of the most famous lines in literature. In the midway of this, our mortal life, not exactly my favorite incipit in translation. And we look down and we see this was done by Henry Francis Carey. 1805. It's one of my friends, in fact, Edoardo Crisafulli, who happens to be of all places the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Kiev. So he left Kiev when the war broke out. He wrote his PhD on this translation, doing exactly what we couldn't do in detail here, where we're just doing it at face value, showing what it felt like to do this translation in the 1800s. Okay, now, who did we pair him with? So we continue on, we go and find Canto 1, which will be at the very end of the book. And let's go down and see who we have here as a translator. So we've got Ned Denny. Now, this is a genius. So born in 1975. We published this before his own book came out, which is titled B. And I think he has chosen different words for Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, all beginning with B. Now, in the midst of the stroll of this life that some call good, that's fantastic. I mean, even just the choice of the word stroll, is life a stroll? But there's a sort of a fresh air, modern, almost cheeky, colloquial, upbeat things. And I can assure you that behind this translation, which is done in stanzas of 12 lines, if I remember correctly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Each stanza, in stanza of 12 lines, and it's all astrological. And Ned explained to me why he picked 12s, and I jokingly said, it's one line for every apostle. But you can see, similarly, I'm going to try and find, so you can search it in different ways, like your traditional way. So I'm going to go to because I'm working on him at the moment, I'm going to go to Shemusini and try to find his translation. So Canto 3. So we're going to go and pick Canto 3, and Shemus's translation is right here. So here's the entry to Real Inferno. Here you've got the door that says there's no hope, abandon hope, or you go through me. Now, Shemusini, and that's the reason why, for example, I'm talking about him with you, has an experience that many readers have. He reads Dante as an undergraduate in translation. He can't finish it. He's not ready for it. And he was very well equipped because he had studied Latin. He had studied Virgil, the Aeneid, in school, at university. This doesn't quite happen. But then something does happen. He's conscious of what happens in the North and the Trouble, where you have sectarian struggles between Catholics and Protestants, where religion apparently is the reason for discrimination and violence. And if you ever happen to be in Dublin and you go to the National Library of Ireland, where Seamus papers are now kept, you will see his translation of Ugolino, that dramatic, not this canto, but another one, that dramatic canto where someone is punished for being a traitor politically and is put in a tower and starved to death with his children. Now, some political prisoners in Northern Ireland starved themselves to death. So clearly, there you have a poet who wants to preserve his integrity as a poet and his independence as a human, as a citizen, and wants to talk about the North. He wants to talk about political struggles and strifes and violence. And he wants to talk about what happens. The story of Ugolino is perfect. And as Seamus explained himself, he explained it beautifully in an interview. He does say, Osip Mandelstam, who, if you haven't read it, Osip Mandelstam's essay on Dante is probably the best essay ever written. And in there, Mandelstam says, when you read Dante, Dante always has the feeling of a prison visit. There's the urgency of a prison visit. And most of them are prison visits. So imagine, Seamus reads that, he thinks about the prisons in Northern Ireland, the Mace prison, Catholic, IRA, activists who are, for better or for worse, upholding their own beliefs, are denied the rights of political prisoners. They decide to starve to death. So Dante becomes a metaphor. So he's translating medieval Florence and Dante's Inferno, but he's actually writing about Belfast in the early 1970s. By the same token, he also says, but a works of literature is also independent. You do it for the joy of it. And that's when he also says that reading Dante gave him such a charge that he decided he was going to do the Inferno, the whole Inferno. And here we have Canto 3, but that's where it ends. He couldn't go past Canto 3 because he didn't have, as he said, enough purchase of the Italian and of the Terza Rima to be producing something that would be rewarding for 34 cantos. But the first 3 is there. So here we've got Canto 3, we got the back, and we see another Canto 3. So let's see the opening line here. Through me it leads to the city sorrowful. So per me si va nella città dolente. So that's the line, that's Dante's line. And in Canto 3 here, through me the way into the suffering city, through me the way to the eternal pay, through me the way that runs among the lost. And whose voice is this? You see, I don't even remember all the translators. This is, oh yeah, my, again, I have a lot of time for him, my beloved Alan Mandelbaum. His translation when it was published got a bit of criticism from other Dante scholars and other Dante translators. Alan Mandelbaum was a wonderful, fine poet, translator of Italian poetry, including Quasimodo. I got to know him very late in life. I still have his pictures here in my office. And of all people, the muse, we were talking about Beatrice, the muse of another Italian poet, Irma Brandeis, who was teaching at Bard College at the time, a Dante scholar herself, answered the critics by defending this translation. So I guess, if you even just look at the book this way, the To Hell and then the Way Back, for us, it was a way of showing different engagement with the text, different registers of English from different continents. I think we've got English. I don't think we've got India, but we've got English, we've got from Scotland, Ireland, UK, America, Canada, Australia, other parts. So there are a variety of intonations. And this, of course, goes to the universality, talks about the universality of Dante. And then one of the things I always say to my students, the best way to remember Dante is to pick up a passage or a line that really matters to you and learn it in Italian. And then the joy is not to criticize a translation and how close, how good, how bad, how fluent, how not fluent it is. But it is to say, this adventurous journey, how close are we getting to the message that Dante is saying? And I'll finish off with just one remark. If we go back to Canto 1, but I'm going to go back to Canto 1 here. And now, how many ways can you have to translate nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita? You know, at some point you're going to run out of option. But a good poet and a good translator is someone who does create and regenerate options all the time. And I think this anthology, we could have gone on and on, because I think what happens is when we get to the book, I think there's more after this. We're starting again. I think that's what happened. That's what we decided to do with team. Yeah, we start again. We start again from Canto 1, and I think it's Clive James's that see, we're starting again. So we go through hell, we come back, and then we start again. And this can continue. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe in 20 years, 30 years, someone can extend this and do a third round and go back to hell, go all the way back to hell and then come back.
That is the coolest project I have ever met. About that playful and creative book of yours titled Quantum of Dante, whose signature art algorithm playfully invades the entire text. Could you tell us why the quantum of Dante per se, and why the word ant becomes this Borg-like simulating and devouring force that drives the text?
It's a very you asked me very nice questions. Now there's two coincidences here. Okay, so one is I was teaching a class of, broadly speaking, comparative literature, and I used a passage which is in Quantum of Dante at the end of the story from Vedic literature, Vedic wisdom. Again, I'm very drawn to those texts, and it's the story of essentially a servant, a slave, and a king. And the king is looking, the king has been, we can associate images and metaphors and symbols the way we like. But the story is very simple. It's needed to perform a task, and the king asks someone else to find this person to help carry the king around on a palanquin. And they identify this guy. They say, oh, it's big, strong, perfect. So on they go, but then the palanquin starts to wobble. And the king gets really annoyed. He says, I thought you gave me this guy who's strong, but look, he can't even do his job. And the servant replies, the king, Your Majesty, I saw a file of ants and I didn't want to crash them. So he wobbled because he's avoiding them. And of course, in Vedic wisdom, the most minute of the animal. And of course, the king realizes that he's not a slave that he's talking to, but he's talking to a wise man, to the incarnation of God himself. And so I had this image of ants. And at the time, I also had not an infestation, but there was a little colony of ants traveling in my kitchen. They were coming and going, and I could see them. And I, of course, didn't want to kill them far from me. So ants were playing with my mind at the time. And then one day I was literally staring at the image you're looking at and say, what can I do to you, Dante, that I haven't already done? And I said, there's the ant and the name, and I'm going to do something. So quantum, I thought of Quantum of Solace, is a 007 film. And I said, and also quantum is, of course, it's a word that I think Joyce uses in Finnegan and Swake, and that's been taken by physicists. And it's also some sort of due that you pay when you do something wrong, some sort of penalty you got to pay. So I say, I'm going to run through this. And then the story took an interesting turn. So I fabricated this idea that the first Italian who came to New Zealand carried a copy of the Commedia with him. And because we know that his name is Antonio Ponto. So Antonio Ant was also there in the name of Antonio Ponto, the first Italian who came over. He came by boat, and often the soil used for ballast in the boats would have had ants in it. And the ant is not an indigenous animal in New Zealand. So someone must have brought it somewhere. So all these stories started to happen. And then, of course, there's this wonderful, you'd love him, Chinese New Zealander illustrator called Ant Sang. Well, it's short for Anthony, I think. Yeah. And I said to him, can you do, if you look at his work on his website, it's amazing. You can clearly see he's mediating between Chinese and New Zealand culture or identities. And I said, can you just do 10 ants for me in different positions, and I'm going to pepper them around the book. and I don't know if you noticed, but every time the 3 letters appear in the book, of course they are emboldened, but what happens at the very last occurrence of the last 3 letters, the ant has actually gone into the text. So the ant has moved from the margins, it's gone in instead of the letters. Wow. So when I launched this book alongside the other anthology, a lot of people said, what is this? And often I'm in the bookshop, the book is still there, and people don't know I'm the editor. I can hear people saying, what is this? Why this? What does it mean?
That's right. Yeah.
It's a playful take on the commedia. Well, one thing that the look of it, it's a very small book. I think I have here somewhere. It's a very small book. It feels like what a medieval book could have looked like. The internal of it looks like a breviary, like one of those prayer books. And I've relinquished lines completely. It's like Finnegan's Wake. It's one big long window of text, but it's the whole comedy. And then at the end, I wrote a little essay to explain what happened. And there's a gift. There's actually a little gift at the very end. The first sentence of Inferno is translated into Maori, the indigenous language of New Zealand, for the very first time. And there's also the word ant in Maori there, hidden in the text also. So it was a bit of a playful little coffee table book.
Quantum of Dante is a fun work. It's such a fun work that you did during the COVID pandemic, actually, which I think is very timely inspiring. Another book you also completed during this period is titled More Favorable Waters. Aotearoa poets respond to Dante's Purgatory. This is actually the second book you collaborated with your student, Timothy Smith. So what gives you guys the inspiration to put contemporary New Zealand poets in conversation with Dante?
Well, it's again a way of testing the relevance of Dante, and our initial plan was to do a trilogy. So we've done To Ellen Becker's Inferno. We said we're going to do something with Purgatorio, and then we'll do something with Paradiso. Now, the reason for More Favorable Waters is geographical. When Dante, goes down Inferno and comes out on the other side of the planet, he describes the Southern Cross. It's not quite New Zealand geographically precisely, but it's close enough for us to think that Purgatorio is right here. So, and the way that Dante describes the Southern Cross, very moving when you see the Southern Cross, and yet to think that in the early, in the 1300s, Dante was able to describe the Southern Cross so beautifully. And so we thought, okay, let's recreate the mountain or the hill or whatever of Purgatorio in New Zealand. And rather than going for translation, this time we went for creative translation. So we gave a passage from the 33 cantos to each poet that we chose, 33 poets from New Zealand, and the variety of styles, ethnicity, age, sexuality, whatever. It's actually a wonderful rainbow collection from every point of view. And some of the stories, some of the cantos are beautiful. Some of the poems that were written are just beautiful. And as we speak, the Italian edition of this has just come out in translation, where 33 Italian poets have translated the 33 poets from New Zealand. But so a motivation, geographical, Purgatorio is here. Also, I think it suits Kiwis pretty well. It's not too theological. It's not too brutal. It's not too infernal. And New Zealand is a wonderful place. I think even the landscape, the book cover was the result of a book cover competition we launched. So we asked New Zealand illustrators to create the cover. And if you saw the images, we got some wonderful entries, and some of them have all the cultural symbolism of New Zealand. Now, the cover that has actually been chosen as the book cover was the publisher's choice, was the publisher's favorite. It wasn't mine. I had another favorite, and the one that I had, I might show it to you another time, was so beautiful because it was so New Zealand. It was actually it's a postcard from New Zealand. So here we are sending Dante a postcard from the place that he describes so well, even if he wasn't able to come.
I would rather have you keep talking for 3 days or maybe more than that, but we are running out of time. Just want to say thank you so much, Marco, for sharing your expertise, but you really managed to make Dante such a fun read. Well, thanks again for coming to the show.
You're very welcome, Claire, and thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.